Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank podcast. She's back into the blank. It's Dr. Not, do you still go by Dr. Valerie?
Sure.
Now, you
Yeah,
recently
it's
kind
good.
of changed up from our last conversation, though. You're an inspirational person now.
Well, no, I feel like I'm the same person,
Mm-hmm.
but if you're talking about my Instagram bio, what happened was I joined this like marketing pod because I'm just trying to figure out what to do with myself online. And so I talked to somebody who does Instagram marketing and I said, well, what I actually do is just share poetry and translations and older stuff and ancient stuff. And she goes, well, a lot of people, especially people who don't have your background, might look at that as inspiration, like those inspirational quotes you find online with the backgrounds and stuff, like the mountain. And then it says,
Success, and it's a
if you
person
work hard.
parachuting or something, right?
Right. Yeah. Like you used to see at school. And to be honest, I really resisted that at first because when I was in school and I saw posters like that, I was like, yeah, that's not real life. And also, that's kind of lame.
Yeah.
I mean, I say this as somebody whose grandfather lied about his age in World War II so that he could jump out of planes to fight Nazis because he was actually too old when the war broke out to be a paratrooper. So he just told them a different age and they didn't check because they didn't really care. I guess they figured if you actually want to do this, like, why not? Just go ahead, just do it.
Well, what's interesting about that is
Um,
just like if that person may be contacting you and saying, "Hey, a lot of your stuff is inspirational." You can look at that with like a deep meaning to it. It's like, have we been leaving messages from the past to the future, maybe, of the fact of trying to find a better way to find a life, find inner peace, find this harmonious thing? It seems like this conquest. Like if you were going to ask me, uh, what is the subject of life? Well, life is obviously going to be what you make it. But what is the subject of this thing that we've all been experiencing for how many years you've been alive? It's this whole concept of where do I want to go? What's the path to be chosen? And how must I find myself? And these four horsemen they talk about in any religion, and any of these things that talk about a plague or talk about disease or talk about all these negative influences, it's around us 24/7 that we don't really pay attention to. We kind of talk about depression is getting a giant spotlight recently. And it's like there's all these factors. And for it's not just this time now that we're experiencing it. We've been experiencing this forever, but people have found ways to deal with it. And the copious amounts of stress we've only been experiencing more and more is mostly technologically based. But we have to find a way to adapt. And I think a lot of the adaptation to it is definitely in some of the key older stuff. Like if you look through a lot, I mean, I joked with you a little bit about the fact of what we wanted to talk about. Everybody wanting to be a philosopher. It's like we're back in like 250 AD or something. Everybody's like, has the inspiration or have this. There's a way to do it. And it's in the past as well. We're still thinking the same. When I hear some person talk about like, you have the own keys to your car to be able to drive it wherever you want, and everyone else is just a GPS. I'm using that example because that's my own example. But it's the same thing back in the day was make sure you can find your fire, make sure you can find your source and sustainability of where you want to go in life and go that route. Make sure you have enough food for the next day. Don't pig out all in one night and ruin the whole feast. It's this whole concept that we've been literally chasing for thousands of years if you really look at it.
No, I completely agree. I mean, we're human beings, and people in the past were human beings too. I mean, I have a friend on Instagram. Um, Gosh, I only remember her handle right now. She's Stone Age Monkey there, and she works on Neolithic archaeology, so prehistory. And basically, what she does is she looks at these artifacts of Neolithic peoples like axes or arrowheads or needles. She does a lot of work with bone needles and different kinds of pelts and things that were sewn together and how they were put together. And one of the things she always talks about in her posts is hey, look, this is so far back in the past that a lot of times we think about it as something abstract, like, oh, this is a stepping stone on human evolution. And look, we started out from here and now we've got computers. But what she does in her work is she slows way down and she's like, look, these people were people. And they had a lot of the same wants and needs as we do, and probably the same thoughts and feelings. I mean, there isn't a lot of evidence, for example, for Neolithic music, although I think there's one idea of an instrument. But one of the things that she highlights a lot when she talks about her work and work in that field is that people, especially archaeologists, they want to see a purpose to everything. Like, okay, what was the useful purpose for this artifact or this place or this, remains of us at a site? And she points out that, sometimes people just make things for
Yeah.
fun, for art. You know, every piece of Neolithic art doesn't need to have a religious purpose. It doesn't need to be a cult statue or something that people worshipped or anything like that, although it might have been. We have to keep our minds open and think, okay, this is possible. But we can also think like, hey, maybe it's just art. Maybe a carver made it because he was like, this is just cool. I'm going to do that.
Yeah, well, it's
Why
so
not?
difficult, like, especially if you're talking about science or if you're talking about predating things, you want to try and find an answer and where can I put this in a peg? Is this going to be a ritual thing? Is this going to be a cooking thing? Is this going to be a way that they use to travel? It makes me really, really baffled at the idea of imagine maybe 1,000 years from now, people from that culture looking back at what we have now, like, what was Twitter? Like, what did the people back then use Twitter for? It's like, well, they would send messages to other people, get in contact sometimes with a celebrity, get really pissed off, like just start wars over the internet, this giant battlefield that no one truly understood its grasp of things. And it makes you really understand, like, I think the idea of wanting to be a philosopher has definitely increased with the amount of technology we have, but I think that's only the basis of how in history those things get looked on so heavily. I mean, if you look on anything that happens to do with Greek history, Norse history, it all kind of shows the light of the storytellers or the main influencers or the ones that seem 10 years above their time. And those were people like Da Vinci, those were like Socrates, those were like all these people that seemed way more advanced than the general population. But those are just the ones we know about. We don't know about any of the hidden ones. We don't know about any of the ones maybe a lot of people thought the same way, but never really truly voiced their opinions. Like, for instance, doing this podcast, I can tell you right now that everyone that I've talked to usually thinks around the same big thing. We all kind of come to agreement on things that are going on in our head. And that's the fact that regular conversations like this aren't really truly happening anymore. But few people voice their opinion about that. Few people bring a platform to rise to that occasion of letting people know, hey, there's no contact, there's no conversation, there's no sense of empathy in the world. But everybody's thinking it, but nobody's saying it. So maybe that's like that with the history books. There are those few outspoken leaders, the ones that we always look at through history, that voice their opinion rather than speaking it, when maybe the general population thought the same exact thing.
Well, that's a really good point. And I mean, just one thing that I would highlight from my background is um, take, for example, the character of Socrates. We don't know for sure if he actually existed because what we have attesting to his existence is the writing of Plato. So some people think that Plato created him like a character to express these ideas and this sense that you should spend your life asking questions. Now, other people think this character is so vivid and so real that he must have existed. Um, I like to think he did exist. But the main point about Socrates is that when you meet him as a figure in the text, he doesn't do normal things. He's not actually a very responsible guy, right? His wife is always yelling at him. He never has enough money. His clothes are old. He doesn't bathe regularly. He's like that old hobo, or, like maybe the dude. He's not he doesn't care about society. It's not quite at the level of Diogenes the Cynic, who, did unspeakable things in public and would be arrested now and probably like on the sex offender list as well. So not quite that level, but Socrates did not have a steady job. He didn't really care about that. He really just said, okay, I'm going to spend all my effort and all my time and, asking these questions and trying to figure out what's really important in life. And I think you're right in saying that many people have the same sort of thoughts, but a lot of times the responsibilities of daily life get in the way. I mean, we would love to just sit around and talk, but maybe we have to go to work, or we have to take care of people in our family, or we have to do our homework if we're in school. I mean, there's just all these demands on our time. But because of technology, and especially with the combination of like technology and quarantine, I feel like even if you don't necessarily have the time, because I know a lot of people have been super busy in quarantine, especially if their kids are home all day, you feel like you do because you're not really going anywhere. So you feel like, okay, I've got this extra time. What am I going to do with the space in my head? So, in a lot of ways, technology, um, well, if you think about like the technology propaganda in the 50s, right? The idea was that your washing machine or your dishwasher was going to be the housewife's best friend because it was going to save her all this time. I mean, our great grandmothers spent all day doing laundry. That's why there was a laundry day. It just took that long. Now we have a machine where, you dump your clothes in there, you make sure you put some detergent in there, you press a couple of buttons, and you go off and do something else. And the machine actually washes your clothes, right? So technology makes time for other things. And I think, it's certainly around the Industrial Revolution, the idea was technology gives us more time. So we should be more productive with our time. So we should try to do more and
And that's the
make more
issue.
money. But now, especially with a lot of this, like the Internet of Things and everything being totally automated, the question is, well, how much do we actually have to do? And if we're not doing stuff, then why are we here?
That is a very good point because I don't know if you ever remember this comedian. He had a show a long time ago. His name was Jamie Kennedy. He was on like an old school movie about a kid that would break dance and got into a coma for 30 years and then woke up and he had to relearn like to live in this new world. But he's popular comedian, had his own I think it was called the Kennedy Show or something where it was just pranks and stuff. But he put up a really good point because he's been out of the spotlight when for probably in like 2005 2006 he was heavily like a Tom Cruise, I would say. Like he was up there like pretty famous, and then he's just been gone for so long, and he came on a podcast a couple of years ago and talked for like 2.5 hours about the world. And he said what's crazy is how often people will forget about you. Like what I'm doing now is he starts talking about how he now does a clown at people's parties. He dresses up in like as Bart Simpson or something and like plays for kids when he used to be on like television. And he goes, if you're not doing something like a podcast 10, and then after that, you got a movie deal at 11. And then if you got a YouTube live show at 12, and you got all these different things, he rattled off like 4 things. And he goes, then people forget about you. If you're not doing something in that instant, then you're doing nothing. And he said, that's the pressure of what society has done. In a way, we've given ourselves more problems and more things than back in the day when you could sit and contemplate with your thoughts. Here's the thing, though. Are we just because we have all these technology and all this, whatever you want to call devices to be able to make our lives easier and less of a workload, does that make sense to try and dip our hands in more cookie jars, trying to bring on a workload? That workload want. And then at the same time, what's popularized is we want less work, but everything we do creates more work. So it's like, what is that snake eating its own tail thing? Like, why are we creating this manuscript or whatever this simulation type thing of I want to be home and I just want to relax. But when we're home and relaxing, we're never truly not working. We're on our phones. We're doing something that is getting that nagging feeling of having to do something because we can never just sit still for a minute, breathe. I've been trying my hardest recently, especially with how cold it's getting. Smelling that morning air, like as soon as you wake up, that cold that hits your lungs, where you're like, ooh, like it makes you kind of chill a little bit. The tingles go up the back of your neck. I only notice that when I'm on my way to work, when I don't want to be at work, when I'm waiting for it to be over or something is when I truly can express and know those things. And when I get off work and I say I want to focus on those things in those moments, I don't ever do that. I do, I don't know, go to the store, I play a game, I do something on my phone. It's work. That's work. It's a thing. It's distracting you from the main essence that is life, which a lot of people who are naturalists or people that are, you know, want to go out and exploring and want to go traveling. Let's take it back 250 AD or whatever time Socrates was alive. Allegedly, Socrates was alive. Um, Analyzing off the mountaintops and looking off into the distance, spending time with your thoughts. There's a reason why the thinker is sitting on a statue with his fist under his chin. He's thinking, he's contemplating a next move, he's contemplating life. That's work. That's never shutting off. That's never finding the peacetime. You're constantly moving even when you're asleep. So, what's a way to lessen the workload is the answer. Not annihilate it completely, but lessen it because you're always going to have those thoughts in your head. And honestly, in the year 2020 that we're in now, it seems like that's the busiest spot right now.
Yeah, I think we all really live in our heads right now, and I think it has a lot to do with the fact that we're also living through screens, right? So like I'm talking to you and I know you, and you exist and you're a person, but it's still different from like if we were at a coffee shop and sitting across from each other and drinking coffee. Like it's still not in the completely in the third dimension. There's a little bit of distance between us. And I think that kind of distance, in a way, it doesn't matter. We can still have a conversation. Um, but in another way, psychologically, I think ultimately it does bother people because we're social beings. And if you spend all your time, you know, talking through your devices or through your computer, you're still going to feel lonely, even if you're in Zoom meetings for 4 hours a day. And I mean, this is what I see with, my friends online. Um, in terms of like, why are we always working? Well, I've read a lot about that over the years because it's something that's bothered me. And at least from the perspective of American culture, it seems to me that it goes back to this idea of the Protestant work ethic and just, you have to always be useful, you have to justify your existence, you have to be productive. And of course, in our economy now, being productive means like having a job and making money. But in earlier times, being productive could be like, okay, running your farm or doing whatever agricultural work you might be doing. So it doesn't necessarily have to do with the money economy, although now, there's a lot of talk about late capitalism and toxic productivity. And I think a lot of that's really correct. There's this idea that people should always be producing something. We also have an economy that's built on that, right? So if you just decide, okay, look, my job sucks and I hate it, And I'm just going to quit, and I'm just going to spend some time with my thoughts, sitting on my favorite chair, thinking about what I really want out of life. Most people would not be able to do that, right? You'd run out of money pretty fast. Um, Bad stuff would start happening. Maybe they'd turn your heat off, they'd turn your
Yeah.
lights off, and you'd be sitting there. And I mean, maybe depending on where you live right now, you wouldn't get evicted, but maybe you would.
Yeah.
So a lot of people just don't have that luxury. And when we look back in history, a lot of the people who did do things like that, had some independent wealth of their own, or their family's wealth, or were just in cultures where, if your family had a little bit of land, you could just exist. But a good example of what I'm thinking about is, on Instagram, I've been reading excerpts of the poetry composed by Abdullah ad-Dindan. And Dindan is kind of an interesting character. He was this older Bedouin in the middle of the desert in Saudi Arabia. And the guy who recorded and translated his poems, Marcel Kupashik, was the Dutch ambassador to Saudi Arabia in the late 80s and very early, I want to say up until like 1990, but at least generally in the late 80s. So apparently, he didn't have too many official duties, at least that occupied all of his time. And his friends knew that he was interested in poetry and literature. And so they connected him with Dindan, who was one of the last examples of a Bedouin oral poet. So this guy, he was totally illiterate, right? He'd never been to formal school. He grew up as a Bedouin, nomadic, living in the desert in a tent. He had a herd of camels. Um, that was his life, and he composed poetry for fun. Well, I mean, it sounds really romantic. It sounds like, Marcel went and stayed with him in the desert for 6 months and just got to go back in time. But if you read the introduction to this book of poems, in fact, you find that Dindan had a lot of practical modern problems. For one, he needed money, and he didn't have any really to speak of. Because he was so broke, his camels weren't doing very well. His herd was really small, and they were a little bit malnourished. And his relatives, because he'd never married, because he'd always been poor, so he did fall in love with this girl, but the story was, at least as far as Kupashik could piece it together, it was that her brothers didn't want her to marry him because they were like, look, this guy, he's never going to amount to anything. He's not going to really be able to take care of you. We want you to marry somebody who's going to be able to really provide for you. And I don't think this guy will. So he never married. And his relatives were like, they wanted him to sell his camels and to just like run a little store, like a corner store, because one of his cousins had the store, and they were like, look, you're older, you can just sit there, and someone comes and wants to buy like a snack or something, you can take his money and give him the snack. And he really did not want to do this at all, right? I mean, this was not just a totally different lifestyle, this was almost a repudiation of his lifestyle. He would have to leave the desert. He would have to actually go and live in a house. He would then have to go to work in the store. He would have to deal with money. He would have to deal with like the settled lifestyle that Saudi Arabia wanted everybody to adopt, and everybody pretty much has at this point. So Kupashik, in order to get the poems from Dindan, do you know what he did?
What?
paid him because he he was in this argument with his cousins, right? He didn't want to go and do this and run this store. And so they said, you know what? Okay, we won't give you any money then. So see how long you last without our help.
Ah, he snuffed them out.
He managed to sell, I think, one of his better off camels and collected a little bit of money from that. But he still needed more money. So Kupashik was like, look, okay, I'll give you some money if you let me record you and ask you questions about your poems. And so then with Kupashik's money, he was able to feed his camels and just sort of hang on for a little bit longer. And then he came to Kupashik later and he was like, oh, my truck doesn't run like at all. It just stopped running. So he's like, okay, let's have a look at this. It had no oil in it at all. Like none. Like he had this great phrase. I don't have the book next to me. It's in another pile of books at the opposite end of this room, but he had this great phrase describing like it wasn't really an engine, it was just sort of these different parts held together with goo and tape. I mean, it was just, this
Does that
total broken down wreck.
does that ever bring you to question kind of how people see and perceive the world, which I think is like one of the biggest things that we need to understand is like I wish I could ask someone from back in the day like if their emotions were as powerful as they are today. But just with that poem, neglecting some of the basic features, trying to figure out what the main ones are. There's this objective idea that I would love to ask someone from any time period in the past and be like, was it this important to be famous? Why is this such the thing that is known as the key to success? It was like back in the day when they considered, to be good looking or to be on TV, you had to be a size 0. You had to be all these things that don't make any sense to us now. It's like, why is our minds right now so perceiving the idea of fame, which I think is why everyone wants to consider themselves a philosopher, is the idea of wanting to be able to create something and it be law, it be word, but take everything down to its base construct. What is getting you through the next day? Those camels that are being neglected fed in that poem, those could be emotions. Where the sense of empathy could be one of those camels, the sense of inner self-worth, the sense of it seems like anytime someone wants to, find an idea of fame, there's two pathways. One, doing it the nice way, being like, I'm going to be Mr. I love you, man. And then there's the other way, which is I'm going to be Mr. I hate you and I want to debate you. I want to do all these types of things. And it's like the angel and devil on the shoulder. And I'm like, wait a second, what why fame? Why? Because it brings admiration and love. It seems like that was only a thing fit for the gods at one point, so now you're considering yourself a god, and there's where we draw the line.
Well, wow, I'm gonna have to unpack that as usual. I mean, you don't just say one thing, you say 10 things. So first of all, yes, learning about the backstory of this poet really does call to me. Sorry, let me find some words. Learning about the backstory of Dindan helps me realize that even though if I just sit down and only read the poems, I can think, wow, he had such a romantic life. He almost escaped the modern era. Isn't this great? It's like having a time machine. But then you read the introduction, and actually, he's got really modern problems. His truck's broken down. He's not making any money. He's fighting with his relatives. He was so broke, he couldn't get married. I mean, these are all pretty relatable modern problems. And then secondly, you brought up fame. I really think that has a lot to do with the way our society is now. Like, because we're in this reality of scarcity, and I don't think it's real. I think it's false scarcity for what it's worth. I think actually we've got a lot of resources and that people need all kinds of people in the economy. And I think that a lot of this scarcity mindset comes from the fact that there are certain very few number of concentrated interests that are really just hoarding wealth and opportunities right now. And that's what makes things so unstable. Because the idea is if I can't find security, then I'll just, try to get famous and rocket to the top of my social structure, right? So then, it's not just like, oh, maybe I'll have, you know, a six-figure, seven-figure salary, and I'll have a reasonably nice house in the suburbs, and I'll have a reasonably nice car. No, no, no. It's like either you're totally broke or
Yeah.
you're a zillionaire on the internet. And I think we have a lot of sort of internet stories from our time that seem to tell people that this is possible, even though I don't think the individuals in those internet stories would necessarily say, oh yeah, do what I did. But I'm thinking of, like, for example, PewDiePie.
Yeah.
Like, he was just procrastinating in college, and he actually dropped out when he realized that he could make money on YouTube.
Yeah, his
And
videos
now,
surpassed everyone in, I think, like a
yeah.
10-year span. He was at the bottom of the charts and started slowly climbing up with Smosh. They were at a battle. I actually watched a video where they were showing the growth over like 15 years of the whole YouTube concept, and you get to see the bar graphs just slowly. PewDiePie's like, like going fast as crap, like all the way
Mhm.
to the top. But it's different though, because everyone wanting fame now, the weird part is when the famous people started writing books telling other people how to get there. And it's like trying to get a little bit of nectar from the gods or whoever. I'm not trying to say that they're gods or anything, but back in the day, you had a king that was appointed probably through blood, and every relative of his would be the next in line for the throne when he dies. So nobody gave a shit about wanting that position because everybody knew they weren't going to ever have it. It was already there. But in this time period now, it's based on a system of voting, which makes more sense. But it's the concept of like now when those people get into power, they start giving off that information, and it's not truly the information needed to succeed because everyone starts doing it. Each person is unique. Each person has their own climb to top, and everyone has their secret. I believe just like a book, there is something for everyone. There is one that fits you to a T, a pathway, a life decision, a goal, a way to climb to the top. You just have to find it. But it seems like when that gets sold to people, like, hey, do what Gary Vee says, or do this or do that, it ends up flipping the script of now everybody has this thing to work off of, but they're upset that it's not working out the way they want. It's like, why isn't this thing that this guy who's really popularly known gave me to succeed and it's not working? Well, that was fit for him. We're
Well,
changing as
exactly.
people.
Exactly. I mean, I think you're totally right. And one of the things that, since I've been looking into internet marketing, one of the things that some of the most successful people I've seen online say is you have to be authentic. Um, we live in a world where we're just saturated with ads and media. So, if you grow up being sold things on TV, you develop this sense of, yeah, I think, he just wants me to buy something, or she's just trying to get ahead. Like, you kind of have this sense when people aren't really being forthright with you, and you just tune it out. So, on the other side, if you want to market, and the idea is you really have to be yourself, and be truthful and be honest and say, hey, this is a thing. I want to share it with you. These are the reasons why I want to share it with you. This is why it's important to me. This is why it's helped me. And I think it can help you too. And people will respond to that. But people don't respond to like the zillions of lemmings copying the one famous person
Yeah.
because we've already seen it.
Well,
And
it's like multiple. It's like a miss, or what would it be called? There's a syndrome behind imposter syndrome. Nobody knows who they are anymore. It's the hardest thing because you're so busy structuring yourself off other things. It's like if looking from a marketing aspect, which I think I would freaking do amazing in, because I have two thoughts that go through my head every time I think of a product. Would I like it? And who's the audience? So when I ask hot sauce makers, I go, hey, when you're selling your product, who are you thinking it for? Well, I'm thinking it for this general age population. You're narrowing it down for the people that would be interested in buying something like that, which is a great marketing thing. But you can't do that in real life. You can't sell yourself to people with a false idea of yourself. That's the hardest thing to understand is with the authentication thing. I like listening to real things. I like it when I listen to a podcast and a dude talks about like starts getting emotional talking about his stepdad and stuff. It's like, yeah, because I can try and relate to that. But when you listen to something that's like radio where it's like, we're going to be giving off a giveaway, it's like, where's the realness factor? It might fit for some people, but it's like the world is trying to find itself as much as we are. We're still uncovering many new things about this thing. But one thing I never I guess, noticed about the old school times, back in AD or BC, for instance, I don't think anybody was really trying to find themselves. I don't think anybody was mimicking others to copy another person. I think everybody was trying to do their own thing and best way of survival, which I believe we've lost. It's like I said, I'm not a motivational guy. I don't like motivational stuff, but I love listening to it when it's not being sold to me, when it's not something I have to pay $4.99 or $6.99 for, because I believe that we're all kind of going through it. We're all swinging through the motions, even Kanye West and me, or, we're at the same level. Everyone is. I believe just some people figured out a way to get to the top and everyone has an idea to get there.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think you're right. And by the way, you just hit the nail on the head with marketing. One of the first marketing lessons that we had in this course was what you're told if you just like download the free stuff online is, oh, well, you've got to do your market research. And so often people think that market research means, like you just said with the hot sauce maker, you look at demographics, right? Okay, I want to target men between the ages of 18 and 24, and they live in the US and they speak English.
Wait,
And
wait, wait. Except your thesis, right? Your thesis is for everybody. Am I
oh,
right?
my thesis is for whoever wants to read it. Absolutely, it's just not been published yet. But people aren't statistics. People are people, and you don't know necessarily. I mean, you can have a sense of who might like your product and who won't like your product, but you have to get an idea of what you're offering. So I'm offering like the most shockingly hot sauce you've ever tasted. I mean, I love hot sauce, for example, and I am not a guy, right?
Yeah.
So if this hot sauce maker wants to make this ridiculous hot sauce, and he's like, well, my demographic is, guys between the ages of 18 and 24. And so I'm going to advertise, on the FX network, or I'm going to advertise on, you know, I don't know, these message boards or Reddit or something. I'm never going to see their stuff, which is really too bad because I want to try their hot sauce, right? So you've got to focus on what you're offering. Um,
It's an issue with grouping, though. It's like the weirdest thing is how our brains want to be able to explain something is when we're explaining the size of something, we were like, how many of these can we fit in it? You compare it to something else. So it's really hard to like, if you're going to keep like, okay, let's say, what's the size of your laptop? Well, it's about like maybe 3 controllers wide, and then it's like 4 controllers tall, and like you're comparing it to something. But when you start putting things in categories, start grouping people, start considering people, and just making a generalization, why is our brain so obsessed with wanting to put something in a category and give it a label? Labeling things, like, for God's sakes, we have a label maker. Like,
we
that's an
do.
that's an invention. But labeling, putting things in categories, is just how we've built this society to be now, putting things in categories. And I think if people are like snowflakes, then why are we labeling them in categories and things when they're known to be spontaneous and be random and be these crazy individual people that go off on different things? Maybe one day you liked a shirt and you never wear it again for 5 years, and then it comes back around. It's this weird twist and pull of we need to make sure we can put something on it. It needs to be classified. Can't really classify people. We're all way too diverse.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you can, but you can't. I mean, I think we share certain things. We share different identifiers. We share different experiences, but that doesn't mean we're the same. I think our brains like to classify things because it's a way of going from completely unknown and possibly threat thing to, oh yeah, I've met something like this before. I know how to deal with it. And if you can put something in a category, that means you know how to deal with it. If you can't put something in a category, that means you have no idea how to deal with it. It's completely unknown to you and it's possibly threatening. You know, it's like a survival instinct, I think, from what I've read. But we have to be careful and we have to just be really mindful of these different instincts that we have or these different predispositions that we have, because we can check ourselves and say, okay, I'm classifying everything, but is this a good call? Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. It really just depends on the circumstance. Like if you're just trying to understand something quickly, or like say I hear a siren, I could think, oh, you know, it's the secure alarm thing and somebody's trying to break in the house. Oh no. Or I could think, hey, I live on a relatively busy street near a fire station, and I hear fire trucks basically like 5 times a day, every day, because every time somebody in this town needs a fire truck, at least in this area, it's got to come from right across the street from me. So probably the siren has nothing to do with me. So this is, you know, my brain putting things in categories. So I'm not freaking out every time I hear a siren
Yeah, it's kind of like
because
creating a fake backstory to things. A lot
mhm,
of people do. Like if you hear someone's voice over the phone, you try and analyze maybe in your head of what that person might look like, trying to create a depiction. And then, like for instance, I had a story about a guy I used to at my old gym. Like for 5 years, I just kept seeing him come in. He had no legs. He had metal legs, like the little prosthetics. And I made a fake backstory in my head that he was in the war because he always wore camo. And then at my new job at a gym, I saw him and I was like, dude, I was like, so the legs, man, I have to ask because we used to go to the same gym. I mean, for years I would see you. If you don't mind me asking, how did you lose your legs? In my head, I thought he lost in like a war thing, like he's a veteran or something. It's not uncommon. He goes, diabetes. I'm like, damn, like you shattered my whole fake backstory I made up that I literally was like, I was thinking, like I convinced myself that's what it was and stuff. But kind of what happens is when we're trying to lump things into categories is trying to be able to, like you said, explain the unexplainable. But isn't that the cool part about it being unexplained? I think it's more of like an ego thing with humans, is that we have a challenge that we need to we need to conquer. It's another flag on the or on a hill that we want to put on there. You know what I mean? It's this whole concept of we want to be able to understand it, but man, some things are just unexplainable, like the Big Bang, for instance, or black holes, for instance. We don't know how those things work. And that's the biggest stump to science and why everyone's going after it. I'm like, it's a mystery. And the world's known to have mysteries. There's things like you said, Socrates, we don't know if he's real or not. That's a mystery. And I guarantee you, people are going to be chasing that down all the way for however long it takes to get discovered, just on the concept of it is something somebody wants to solve. Something it's like when you go to a new planet, you get to name the species, whatever you discover. You get to name it whatever you want. It's that personalization of like, oh my God, like I solved it, so I get the credit for it.
well, exactly, and I think this ties back into what you were saying about fame too. And people want to be known; they want to make their mark. Um, and so, if you can conquer your surroundings and effectively categorize everything around you and say, okay, you know, I know how to deal with this, I know how to cope with this, then maybe, you'll be the one making the discovery, or you'll be the one that everyone will remember. And a lot of times, at least in our modern society, people think of fame as a way to make money, or as a way to um, get something more, a bigger platform, have more people listen to them, get a bigger house or more friends, or just, whatever it might be that they lack in life. But I think at least at a certain point, when you're working on something, you also want to create a legacy for yourself. I mean, at the end of every president's term, everybody in the press starts talking about legacy, right? Like, what's Obama's legacy? Is it just Obamacare? Is it something else? What is it? And I think that's a human need too. Now, you were talking about fame in the ancient world and the modern world, and that reminded me of a line from the book 3 of the Iliad, where Helen and Paris are together in the palace in Troy, and this is after the goddess Aphrodite has stolen Paris away from the one-on-one combat that the Greeks and the Trojans have set up, because they're tired of the war, right? They want to go home, and they have this meeting, and they're like, look, we're here because Paris ran away with the wife of Menelaus. So let's have Paris and Menelaus fight. We don't have to fight each other. They're the ones with the conflict. Let's have them fight. And whoever wins gets to take Helen. And then we're done. But Aphrodite doesn't let this happen, right? Because she knows she's a goddess. She set up this whole situation, first of all, by giving Helen to Paris, right? But then she also knows that Paris is not as good of a warrior as Menelaus. So if she leaves everything to take its natural course, Paris would lose, and Helen would go with Menelaus back to Troy, and she doesn't want that to happen at that point. So she envelops Paris in this mist and magically transports him back to the palace. And then Paris and Helen talk. At the very end, Helen says, people in times to come will sing songs about us. So she's suffering, right? Because she feels like they're fighting over me, and I'm causing all this strife. I'm causing this war, and I don't know what to do, and I don't know how I feel about it, because she knows a lot of the Greek soldiers personally, right? They were her husband's friends. She entertained them and welcomed them in their palace. So she's in an impossible position as a human being. And so she says, well, at least people will remember us and sing songs, that is, compose poetry about us. And when I first read that as an undergraduate, I was really impressed, because I thought, well, we still are.
Yeah.
We don't actually know for sure how old this poem is, right? So we don't even, I mean, different people have different guesses, but it's incredibly ancient. It's more ancient than most of the ancient texts you can think of. And we're still talking about it. So for the ancient people, either, I guess, you could get taken up into heaven as a god, or the companion of a god or a goddess, or you could get that kind of fame, the sense that people will remember your life story, or something that happened to you or that you did in your life, and will tell and retell this story so that no one will ever forget you. So that was that sense of fame.
It's kind of like I tweeted a long time ago. This idea was like, what is it better to be remembered by few forever, or be remembered by millions for just a second? That quick glimpse of fame. Is it better to have close people that would be at your funeral and remember you long after you're gone, or be famous for 10 minutes. A lot of people would choose that fame, but like power corrupts. Absolutely. Whenever you get power, it turns into a corrupting thing. It kind of leads down this sense of like, when we look at the gods, for instance, like back in the day, it seemed like they manipulated, they twisted, like the people on earth with their own little puppet show. They were their own little things and constructs that can create these enemies and have them battle. Like, oh, he said this about you. Oh, he said this about you. That's happening today. Is because people, it comes from a comfortability factor. The gods didn't have to worry about jack shit. The gods didn't have to worry about getting killed or having to eat or anything like that. They had all the power that they needed to. We don't really have to worry about eating. A lot of people don't. We really don't have to worry about a lot of different things. And next thing you know, we're starting fights with other people. We're watching that violence. We like seeing it play out because it feeds the ego. It feeds our attention, like reality television.
Yeah, exactly. And people get bored. And I think one of the things, at least in those depictions of the gods that you're referencing, um, they're anthropomorphized, right? They're made into human beings. And so human beings are thinking, well, what would I do if I were alive eternally? And there's that line from Groundhog Day, right? um, when he's with Rita, the producer, and she goes, this is what you do with eternity. You're perfecting your throwing cards into the hat game. This is what you do with eternity. And I think what Groundhog Day teaches you is that, yeah, some aspects of eternity maybe are pretty boring. Like imagine if you couldn't die and you had to keep living, especially in that situation where the same day repeated over and over and nobody around you remembered anything that you did, which is why I think that's such a great movie, actually. But in terms of pursuing fame, I'm just thinking of a modern example. um, I don't know if you know much about T.E. Lawrence of Arabia, but he was, well, he went to Oxford and his degree was in history, but then he got a research position in archaeology. So he ended up on the Syrian-Turkish border, actually, where there have been clashes not all that long ago. And he was part of an archaeological dig there. And that was that plus some other adventuring around he did as an undergraduate, where he did his thesis on Crusader castles in the Middle East. So he hiked out there in the summer because he was insane, and he sketched out all these castles, and he got beaten up, and he got his camera stolen, and he almost died, and he got malaria. But he came back and he got it first on his thesis, so he got an A plus, basically, for that. So he learned Arabic, sort of, and then World War I happened, and he was recruited to go and work with these Arab tribes, these Bedouin tribes who were rebelling against the Turks. Right, and the idea was if the British could take advantage of this, they could undermine the Turkish military and be an effective thorn in its side. Well, so he went down there, and when he spent time with these people, he became really loyal to them. He ended up wanting to fight for an independent Arab state, which was not at all what the British had in mind when they sent him down there. They just wanted him to do an operation and then be done with it. But he wanted more than that for the people that he had fought with. He wanted them to have some measure of independence. He thought that would help them moving forward. He wanted them to be part of the modern world. He didn't want them to be, just part of the Ottoman Empire. And the Ottoman Empire was on its way out anyway. And so he had been sort of made into this hero or this romantic figure by this American newspaper reporter who had written all these stories about him and then sent them back to, was it the Chicago Tribune? I'm not sure. One of the major American papers. And so he started to become actually quite famous. And once at the end of the war, he realized how famous he was because, you know, World War One was this horrible, grotesque event. And there were very few inspiring stories of heroism to come out of it. When people looked at his story, first of all, you know, it wasn't the dirty trench warfare that we saw on the Western Front. It was this very um, almost just dreamlike idea of these nomadic people riding their horses in the desert, you know, going and raiding different camps. And it was almost, you know, almost like a story even when it happened. So he thought, okay, I'm famous. I'm going to use my fame. I'm going to try to see if I can leverage this fame and um, get support for Arab independence.
So using the fame not in the aspect of selfishness, but being able to help in a better way.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a debate about how much he was a self promoter, and I think if you read his letters, I've read a few of them, it's clear that he was very conflicted about fame. He didn't really mind making having the connections that he had, but he didn't use them to enrich himself. Like he wrote a book about his experiences in the war. He called it Seven Pillars of Wisdom. And he gave most of the money from that away. He didn't uh, want to benefit from it, really. He had a lot of connections which he used to help other people around him. He didn't didn't actually have a very comfortable life after the war. But at the same time, you know, he was behind a couple of different projects about himself. So there were
Well,
a
it's a
couple of
it's a deep
biographies written of him.
it's a deep thing though that you're going into is the fact of when you ask somebody if they're willing to lend a hand to help somebody else by using some of their fame or using some of their personality or using anything that doesn't really, it's always got to be a factor of, but what am I getting out of it?
Right.
What am I going to get out of this deal, this transmission? I mean, I experience it all the time. If I'm talking to someone to do a podcast or something, I'll get someone that says, okay, but how is this going to benefit me? It's like, I don't know, conversation. It's like you need to have something to get somebody lured in. Like when you go fishing, you have to have a worm on the hook, or people aren't interested, or you have to have a certain number of followers or something is what we consider wealth now. That's like money now to us. Um, it's it's a strange thing. I think the world has really taken this shift of there's two personality types that go in the lines of social media, who we are today. And that's either Atlas, where you feel like you're holding up the world's problems on the top of your head and you just can't handle it anymore, or you're the idea of what Prometheus is, thinking that you can steal the fire to be able to give it to people and then you would be suffering for all eternity. That idea for a lot of people isn't something that is very, very pursued because nobody wants to lose everything trying to help another person. It's easier to either stay safe, keep your head down, or find a way to rise to the top and then be loved by millions, like Zeus. Everybody wants to be Zeus.
I think that's true. Everybody does. I guess I brought up Lawrence because he had this fame and he tried to leverage it. He had a certain measure of success, I suppose. There were peace negotiations in 1921, in Cairo, where the Western powers, the Western colonial powers, basically divided up the Middle East, and he argued passionately that there should be an independent Arab state, and from this, the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan was born. Now, we can argue about how truly independent it was or is, because it definitely had British influence and still does, and now also American influence too. But, you know, technically, it's an independent Arab state. At the same time, at at the end of his life, he really just wanted to disappear. He enlisted in the RAF under a fake name. Well, not totally fake. He took a different last name. Before that, he'd enlisted in the Royal Tank Corps under a completely fake name. The military found out and kicked him out. Said, "Hey, you can't do that." He spent a lot of time at the end of his life trying to escape this persona of Lawrence of Arabia,
So is
which
it?
I think is very ironic.
It is. I mean, that's the concept of when you get too much power, though, and you're in the eyes of people. Look at every famous actor that's been out here today. What do they all want to do? They all want to hide. They don't want to be in the limelight. It's so hard. Imagine if TMZ's at your doorstep every single day. It's going to be fun for 2 weeks. Then it's going to be really annoying when you can't go to the bathroom without a camera being shoved into your face. You know, I got it all the time when I used to do jet skis. I used to work doing jet skis all the time. People are like, you must have a dream job. First 2 weeks was fun. The other 3 years were not, because of the factor of you're constantly on a jet ski, dehydrated, covered in salt water, and you're in the sun all day, 12 hours, 14 hours without eating. It's miserable. You're like, takes all the fun out of doing a jet ski. I hope I never get on one for the rest of my life. Like it's that concept of, I think with the idea of fame, it's one of those things where it should be in a quick glimpse. It should be like those child stars that get out of it and you never hear about them again, because of the aspect of when it continues for so long, it beats and breaks you down to a point where you're not yourself anymore.
Well, yeah, because I don't think any of us, and this is even allowing for what I said about authenticity in marketing, I don't think any of us can be our whole selves if we become famous. I mean, there are always parts of ourselves that are more private, that we just don't put on display, not necessarily because we're hiding anything or we want to lie to people, but just because they're private. And so I think if you become famous, there is this sort of image of yourself that's created. And then people who get to know that image through your fame think that that's you. But you know, it's not really you. And imagine, you know, I just brought up T.E. Lawrence, because I thought that was an interesting example of getting fame, trying to leverage your fame, and then trying to escape it. But imagine if you're an actor,
Oh man.
because Lawrence, he was a military man, right? So he fought with these Bedouin, and he had stories of, you know, different conquests. They seized Aqaba. At the Battle of Aqaba, they seized that port from the Ottomans, and now it's a tourist destination in Jordan. And if anybody out there listens to this later and we're allowed to travel again, you should definitely go to Aqaba. It's actually really cool. I've been there once. What I wanted to do, because I'm the huge history nerd, was I told my husband, okay, I want to go to the fort, right? Because I wanted to see what was captured in this battle. And you know what? It was closed.
It's terrible.
The fort was closed, but the guy in the office who told us that the fort was closed and the museum was closed, he did sit us down and talk to us, and he was really nice. But I thought that was particularly sad because it was the 100th anniversary of the Arab Revolt. That was 2017. The Arab Revolt was 1917. And I was just like, it's the centennial. How can you close the fort on the centennial? But hey, governments, what can you do? But imagine if you're an actor, right? You're famous because you can read a script and get into a character for the purposes of a play or a movie, but it's not really you. You know, you're a different person. You have this skill acting, but people who see you in a movie might just identify you with that character. Like I think, oh, back in the day, uh, my sister and I were huge X-Files fans, right? And then when that ended, David Duchovny really struggled to find more work because everybody associated him with Mulder. Like he was Mulder, right? So how could he then be anybody else? But of course, the actor David Duchovny is David Duchovny. He's not Fox Mulder. So I mean, that just adds another layer to this because there's this idea that you can be famous for something that you yourself did or created or were a part of. But imagine being famous for acting and taking on other personas.
Never truly
I,
being yourself.
yeah, I mean, when actors, I think when actors spend time with their public, I don't know that the public. Maybe it's changing now in our culture
It's
because we're
not.
so focused on authenticity, but I don't know that the public really wants to see them. Like I remember there was a
Nobody wants Leo and wants the actual Leo. They want all the roles that he's been in. They want the idea of what they think Leo is. That's
Mhm.
the scary part is, do people want you or do they want the person that you're playing? We never should be so powerful where we're being so involved in decadence that's it's going to be destroying our own innocence. It is one of the toughest things to come to grasp to because so far the one person that we are, the person that we are, it gets a few likes maybe, but it doesn't get the whole world. But if you play a role and it gets the whole world, then that's the person you got to be and that's the person people expect you to be. It's like meeting somebody who's famous. More times than not, they're not the same person that you believed in for so long. I've come to grips with that in person. I've met people that were like, "Ah, man, really? You're not the person I thought you were." It's because of a whole factor of, do you love the person's image or do you actually like the person?
Yeah, well, there's a saying, right? Never meet your heroes.
Yeah. I'd still want to meet Poseidon.
Well, I mean, as what though? Because gods don't usually present themselves to us humans in their full form,
I want
right?
to see the statue of Poseidon. I want to meet him like that. The one that's holding a giant trident with his hand raised above, trying to control the sea, and he's got amazing obliques.
Well, I may be a classicist, but I don't know that I can set you up with this. I I can recommend that there's a temple outside of Athens on the Cape Sunion, the Temple of Poseidon at Sunion, and it's famous in the modern day for being a place where Lord Byron, when he was in Greece, he visited this temple and he was so impressed by it that he carved his name into one of the columns so you can see Byron written there.
It's not a tree. That's art. Why is he doing that?
Uh, he wanted to leave his mark on it. I know it to us now, and especially to me, it seems remarkably tasteless and just like sacrilegious. Even I'm not pagan, but I some of my pagan friends would actually consider that sacrilegious. But anyway, even though the temple is a ruin, it's really impressive, and you can see why the site was chosen because the temple's looking out over this cape, and you can see, the surf hitting the rocks, and it's not really a calm part of the sea. It you can stand there and look out at the ocean and think, wow, okay, this is the kind of power that they thought of when they thought of Poseidon.
A different mindset, one
Well,
that,
yeah, it really
yeah,
is. I think modern people, we have a hard time trying to come to grips with how ancient people actually thought of their gods. We have these examples from literature where the gods are anthropomorphized, and we might think, oh, that's how ancient people thought of the gods. But if you, it's not really clear, um, because in some of those examples, the gods are almost like cartoons, and then you think, like some of the silliness at the end of Iliad Book One, where Hephaestus is going around basically being the court jester, right? Because he's disabled and he goes around limping and he's making jokes and everybody's laughing. And you might think, as a modern person reading this, well, why would you want to worship a group of deities that acted like this? But it's not clear that, that's exactly what they were thinking, ancient people were thinking when they did go to the temple to worship the gods. And if we look, for example, and this is much later in time, Cicero's De Rerum Natura, on the nature of things, he's talking about worship of the gods in the sense of, we don't worship these anthropomorphic images, or these uh, the myths of these gods or the stories about them, because some of them are actually pretty unsavory. And Socrates talks about this, right? Is it the Euthyphro? I think it is, when he's saying, okay, why do you worship the gods? They do terrible things. And in the course of this dialogue, um, what Socrates is driving at is it maybe that we worship the ideals represented by the gods? So strength, honesty, virtue,
morals
beauty.
that we try to aspire to be.
Right. Not this sort of personification of Zeus as the serial cheater, or
Yeah.
or Ares as the guy with serious anger management issues,
Yeah.
right?
I think all those combine into what a person can be, though, as a construct of why there's different tales and different ideas or depictions of the gods, is because it kind of brings in a layer of like, okay, we made him a little bit too powerful. Let's make him a little bit jokey too. Let's make them see like they're not out of the realm of grasp of things that we can aspire to be. It's just this mentality that we've already been there, or we are one, is one that I don't think is ever going to be accomplished. There's always that chasing pursuit. It's a rat race. I think it's this giant thing of wanting to be better than who we are. And I don't think we're ever going to be gods. We're never going to be this overall great person like an Elon Musk, or things that we compare things to. Like I said, it's all about comparisons. But I think it's an idea that is one that we're never going to grasp. And I think it's one that we're always going to be in the pursuit of. And I think that's the point of it. But classifying yourself as one is where my issue comes in. Is like, oh, I'm a god, or I have all the information that can key to your life. It's like, no, you have a bit of it, but everyone's different. And this earth, this world, this life that we live is so mysterious. It's fascinating to me to see how everybody kind of comes around.
Well, I think you hit on some really good points there. Um, and I think I would add to that that in the ancient world, for example, in the Iliad, we have instances where the gods themselves are bound by certain laws, right? There are even boundaries for the gods. There are things the gods can't do, like when Zeus's son, the soldier, Trojan soldier Sarpedon, dies. Zeus cannot just, point his finger and say, you're not going to die. I'm going to take you up with me to Mount Olympus, because he has this Moira, this portion, and that is his portion. He's going to die on that battlefield. Zeus can't change that. Zeus can't alter the fates of human beings. So what does he do? He watches and he mourns with Sarpedon's comrades, the king of the gods. So, and I think modern people have problems with that too, because
we're always interfering.
We exist in this sort of relic of the Judeo-Christian civilization. I don't know that we're in it anymore. I think that there are plenty of people who don't subscribe to that worldview. So we might be sort of beyond that, but it's still our cultural context, right? So when most people think about what God is or what a God is, we just think, oh, well, God can do anything, God can be and do anything. But in the ancient world, in this cosmology in which Zeus exists, there are limits placed on his actions. There are limits placed on all the gods.
Because you need those boundaries to keep yourself in check.
Yeah, and that's the idea, is that if there weren't boundaries put on even the gods, then the whole universe would just fall apart. There have to be rules for things. I mean, not necessarily spelled out rules.
It goes back to the Big Lebowski. You mentioned the dude earlier, where he goes, "This isn't League. This isn't Nam. There are rules. There are rules, Smokey. That's what it is. There are rules." So the Big Lebowski is even bigger meaning to life than we think, and that's why the movie inspired a cult.
Well, fun fact about the Big Lebowski, it's my advisor's favorite movie.
That's my favorite movie.
Supervisor, it's his favorite movie.
That is my favorite movie. I'm part of Judaism. I have my Church of the Latter St. Jude's license.
Okay.
So I'm a history fanatic and a Big Lebowski fanatic.
I remember when I saw that, I watched it with my sister and my dad, and my dad's from California. I'm not.
Does he hate the Eagles?
Yeah. So when he watched that, it was like, he related to it on such a level. And he was just like, at the end, he said, I don't know how anybody who isn't from California would understand this movie.
It's one of those things where it's like you never see him really want anything, and you just see him kind of abiding. That's this thing, the dude abides. And I think that's a lifestyle a lot of people should start living by. Not being careless about everything, but more on the lines of don't let a lot of things get in your way. I mean, he got dunked in the toilet. And he's like, comes back up, like, where's the money, Lebowski? And he goes, I think it's down there. Let me take another look. And they dunk him again. Like they dropped the bowling ball on his floor. They peed on his rug. This whole concept of that didn't let him get him down. Most people would fester on that for months and months and months. He just moved on to the next task. He didn't worry about what he can't control or the past that's already happened. He worried about how is he going to reflect on it in the future. And I think that's a great overall message to take away, especially like kind of wrapping up the episode here. It's like, there's a lot of things going on in the world that we can't control, and being upset about it or doing all these things, we should find a better way to work towards a better future is what always the concept of is. But we keep falling in the same mistakes. And I think there's guidelines that were set to us in the past that reflect onto the future of things that we're doing today that we're not even looking at that history and noticing all the mistakes and trying to find a better way to correct it.
Well, I mean, of course, I think you're right. And one of the things, to go back to the beginning and wrap this up,
Hold on, that sounded so threatening when you're like, "Of course, I think you're right." I'm like, "Look, you could be wrong. Just shoot me if I'm wrong."
No, of course. I mean, what can I say? I've spent my whole life reading about, studying, and visiting and caring about ancient things. I mean, I am not the person to come to if you're saying, well, does the past have any meaning? Yeah, I mean, for me, it absolutely does. Um, and I think people who reject the past just don't have the sense that, hey, we're all human beings and people have been through life before. I think one of the problems that we have in modern times is that people have this sense that, their lives are new and different and special. It's like, well, yeah, maybe there are aspects of you that are different and special, and certainly you have never existed in your form before in the world. But lots and lots of people have lived, and dealt with similar problems or even some of the same problems. And questions of technology or geographic location or things like that, they just really fade into the background. And one of the ways you said I've become inspirational, like I was, because I'm disabled and because I was born with a physical disability, I've always really hated that kind of motivational speaker stuff they feed you in school. Like, you can do anything if you just try hard enough. That really rubbed me the wrong way as a kid, because I'm a kid, right? But I don't believe that, because I'm sitting there, I'm 8 years old or whatever, and I'm thinking, well, I work really hard at some things, but I'm never going to run a marathon. Like, I literally can't do that, and it doesn't matter how hard I work at it, because of my disability, I literally can't do that. And a lot of the motivational kind of stuff that's sold to kids is extremely superficial, right?
Yeah.
And if you have a life experience, especially when you're younger, that demonstrates to you how superficial it is, it's a really easy way to get jaded. And so I resisted being labeled kind of inspirational at first. And then people came to me and they said, well, you translate these proverbs and you share this poetry and it inspires me. And I started thinking, well, okay, if this label helps people find something, then I'm okay with it. And I think a lot of what they're finding inspiring is just this shared experience of life. Like, what's a proverb? It's wisdom that's been passed down through the ages. You can't attribute it to one person, right? It's not Tim Ferriss's book or a particular work of literature written by somebody, Virgil, for example, or Plato. It's wisdom, the kind of thing you hear from your family or your relatives. Just, the
It's different from the norm.
right. Well, but it's also the sort of preserved wisdom of generations of people. Hey, we know this is true. Remember it, right? So one of the, in fact, the proverb I translated yesterday, because I do these every Wednesday for Wednesday Wisdom on Instagram. And the one I did for yesterday, the way I translated it into English was, if you've got to do something, you'll find the courage to do it. But what it literally said in Arabic was, the guest of a lion is killed by scarcity or poverty. And there was a note on it that explained, well, except look at it this way, nobody's ever a lion's guest, right?
Yeah.
Imagine that's not really going to make any sense. And poverty, scarcity never killed anybody outright. So what this really means is, if you've got to do something, if life is putting you in a situation and you know you've got to do something, you'll find a way to do it. You won't be afraid of danger. You'll just be focused on whatever it is you have to achieve. Because these fears that our brains cook up for us, most of them will never come to pass. You can sit and worry about what would happen if I lost my job, what would happen if I went totally broke, literally broke, if I had no money at all, what would happen to me? I mean, I've had those thoughts. And then I've thought to myself, okay, but how likely is it that it would happen? Like, pretty unlikely that I would end up in that extreme of a situation, right? It's just something that our brains do because they're always searching for ways to keep us safe. So they like to imagine the worst case scenario. But what this proverb is telling us is, hey, these worst case scenarios, they hardly ever happen. So, I mean, that's why I like these proverbs, because it reminds us of certain basic realities in life, and also reminds us that people have been there before. We're not doing this alone for the first time by ourselves.
And where can people find your Instagram page? You want to promote that, and also where people can find the wonderful Wednesdays at what time?
Oh, well, my Instagram, I'm actually thinking of rebranding it, but I haven't completely gone through with it yet. So I will just give you the handle that I have now, and if I change it, I guess I can update it in the
When
YouTube
I put
comments
the
or
link in the
something.
description, when people click on it, even if it's changed, it'll still go to your actual profile.
Oh, okay, cool. See, you know more about how this actually works than I do. So my Instagram is Dr. Valerie. So this is DrValerie. And Wednesday Wisdom is just a hashtag people use on social media to share different quotes and things. And what I do with Wednesday Wisdom is right now I share these proverbs that I translate from Arabic into what I consider to be like modern English. So they aren't literal translations. They're things that I think, even if you can't read the Arabic, you can read it and you can do something with it. It's meant to be like approachable, and yeah, so it's not a particular time. It's just a post I do.
I make
When
sure I link it all in the description, and it's always a pleasure having you on.
Well, thanks very much, Robbie. I'm really glad to be back. I'm glad to keep up with your podcast. You've actually gotten me into listening to podcasts. I wasn't really into it before.
Find some better ones. I do okay, but I got some recommendations if you like history and stuff. Dan Carlin's Hardcore History, everybody always recommends that, but I got a couple others on there that you might like.
Well, that's awesome. I'm always glad to sit down and chat with you. I think what this world needs is more just sort of genuine, authentic conversation. So
That's
looking
all
forward
I'm
to being
saying.
back.
That's all I'm
And I
saying.
hope you're going to keep going through 2021. And I'd love to be back with you in the new year to see how things are going and just check in.
We're definitely going to have you back on. And thank you for listening to this episode Out of the Blank podcast. And stay tuned for our next episode.